There is a version of Johnny Carson that everyone thinks they know. The man in the perfectly tailored suit, the one who never blinked, never stumbled, never let a single crack show in the polished armor he wore every single night for 30 years. That version of Carson was real, but it was also a performance, and the most fascinating thing about the greatest performer late-night television has ever seen is what happened when that performance broke. Not because someone forced it to, not because of a technical failure or a bad guest, but because the sheer unpredictability of live television eventually did what nothing else could. It made Johnny Carson forget, even for a moment, that he was supposed to be in control. 30 years is a number that sounds impressive until you actually think about what it means. 5 nights a week, roughly 50 weeks a year, for 3 decades. That is thousands upon thousands of broadcasts, each one demanding that Carson walk out under those lights and be brilliant, be charming, be everything the network and the audience expected him to be. The pressure of that consistency alone would have broken most people, and it nearly did break Carson, though he hit it with the kind of skill that only someone who had been performing since childhood could manage. But here is the thing nobody talks about enough. Carson did not just survive that pressure, he thrived on it. And the moments that made him truly immortal were not the ones where everything went perfectly. They were the ones where everything went completely sideways, and he somehow turned chaos into comedy gold without missing a beat. What follows is a journey through 16 of the most unscripted, unplanned, and utterly unforgettable moments from Carson's legendary run. These are not the moments his producers planned. These are not the jokes his writers handed him on a card before taping. These are the moments that reminded America why Johnny Carson was not just a television host, but a once-in-a-generation talent who could take anything life threw at him and make it better than anyone could have imagined. Ed Ames came onto The Tonight Show in April of 1965 as a working actor, known for playing Mingo on the NBC series Daniel Boone, and he was there to demonstrate the art of tomahawk throwing. It was supposed to be a simple segment. Ames would explain the technique, throw the weapon at a wooden silhouette target, and everyone would move on. What actually happened is that Ames threw the tomahawk with remarkable precision, but it landed directly in the crotch of the wooden figure, and in that single instant, a routine piece of television became one of the most replayed clips in the history of the medium. The audience started laughing immediately, but it was Carson's reaction that turned a funny accident into something people are still talking about 60 years later. Carson lost his composure completely. Not the kind of laugh a host gives when something mildly amusing happens, but a full, uncontrollable, doubled-over, tears streaming down his face laughing fit that lasted nearly 3 minutes. 3 minutes of silence from Johnny Carson while he tried and failed to get himself under control is an extraordinary thing to witness, because Carson was the man who could handle anything. When he finally managed to speak, he delivered a line that perfectly captured the absurdity of the moment, and the audience exploded all over again. What made this incident stick in the collective memory long after countless other moments faded was the authenticity of Carson's reaction. For a man who spent every night carefully managing exactly how much of himself he let the audience see, this was a rare moment where the mask simply fell off completely. Don Rickles was one of the few people on Earth who could get away with anything around Johnny Carson, and the story of the cigarette box is proof of exactly why. Carson kept a wooden cigarette box on his desk, and it mattered. To him more than you might expect. It was his desk, his show, his space, and that box was part of the ritual he had built around 30 years of nightly television. So when Rickles guest hosted in October of 1973 and accidentally broke the box, everyone in the building knew there would be consequences. When Carson came back the next night, he held up the damaged box for the audience to see and promised retribution. But nobody could have guessed what that retribution would actually look like. A few months later, Carson found out that Rickles was taping his sitcom on a nearby NBC sound stage. During a commercial break, Carson turned to his staff and said he wanted to go confront Rickles right then and there. The crew grabbed whatever equipment they could and ran across the studio lot. Carson burst onto the set in the middle of an actual taping, cameras rolling, in front of an audience that had absolutely no idea what was happening. Rickles, caught mid-scene in his Navy uniform, looked genuinely stunned. The exchange that followed was funny precisely because it was born out of real affection. Carson played the offended party, Rickles played the desperate man trying to save himself, and underneath all of it was a warmth that made the whole thing feel less like a planned bit and more like a glimpse into what it looked like when these two legends were simply being themselves. The final episodes of The Tonight Show in May of 1992 carried a weight that everyone in the studio could feel. 30 years of American television were coming to an end, and Bette Midler was there for the penultimate show. The night was expected to be entertaining, but no one anticipated how deeply emotional it would become. Midler had been joking and bantering throughout her segment, keeping the mood light, but then she shifted. She told Carson she wanted to sing something for him, and she began performing a tender version of a classic standard about last calls and goodbyes, singing it directly to the man who had spent 3 decades hosting America's most famous late-night program. The camera caught Carson's face as she sang, and what viewers saw was something they had never seen before. Johnny Carson had tears in his eyes. He did not look away. He did not crack a joke to break the tension. He simply sat there and let himself feel it in front of millions of people, and when Midler finished, he kissed her hand and looked into the camera and said he could not top that. He was right. Nobody could have topped that moment, because it was the first time in 30 years that the audience saw Johnny Carson without any of the armor on. The Tonight Show had a long tradition of animal segments, and Carson's relationship with those segments was complicated in ways that made them must-watch television. In 1979, animal handler Joan Embry brought a capuchin monkey onto the show, and the segment started the way these things usually did, with Embry explaining the animal's behavior while Carson listened. Then the monkey decided that Carson's perfectly styled hair was the most interesting thing in the room. Without warning, it launched itself directly onto Carson's head and began using his hair as a playground. Carson did not panic. He did not swat at the animal or call for help. He simply sat there, perfectly still, with an expression of such calm and resigned amusement that the audience could not stop laughing. His hair was being completely destroyed by a small primate, and Carson just let it happen. When the monkey finally went back to its handler, Carson looked into the camera with his hair sticking out in every direction and delivered a line that perfectly captured the absurdity of the moment. It showcased what made Carson so special, his understanding that the audience was not laughing at him but with him, and his instinct to let the moment breathe rather than trying to control it.
Steve Martin arrived on The Tonight Show in 1980 as someone already reshaping the
landscape of American comedy, and his appearance that night was a perfect demonstration of why. He announced he was going to perform a magic routine, and Carson stepped back and gave him the stage. What followed was one of the strangest things anyone had ever seen on the program. Martin produced increasingly bizarre objects from impossible places, delivering each one with complete deadpan seriousness, while the absurdity kept climbing higher. Carson started the segment as the polite host watching a guest perform, but as the routine continued and got more ridiculous, something shifted. Carson started genuinely losing it, not the encouraging laughter of a host, but the helpless, caught-off-guard laughter of someone watching something so strange that he had no idea what was coming next. By the end, Carson was struggling to keep it together while Martin kept going with perfect, unwavering seriousness. It was a rare night where Carson got to step completely out of his hosting role and simply be an entertained audience member, and you could tell from every second of his reaction that he loved it. Robin Williams on The Tonight Show was not really a Tonight Show at all. Williams arrived on Carson's couch not to promote something or answer questions in any predictable order, but to unleash a storm of improvisation and rapid-fire character work that left everyone in the studio scrambling to keep up. The producers would sometimes panic in the control room, trying to figure out where Williams was going and whether they should cut to commercial. But Carson would wave them off. He recognized that Williams was operating on a completely different frequency than any other guest who had ever sat in that chair, and the only thing to do was let him run. What made these appearances so compelling was Carson's reaction. Here was the man who had spent 30 years being the most controlled person in any room, and Robin Williams was one of the very few performers who could make him genuinely surrender that control. Carson would lean back, wipe tears from his eyes, and simply enjoy being carried along by Williams' genius rather than trying to steer the conversation. Carson once told a colleague that Williams was like trying to catch lightning in a bottle while it was already running away. And that line tells you everything about how he felt about those nights. Don Rickles and Frank Sinatra sitting on the same couch created a tension that was almost impossible to watch without holding your breath. Sinatra had a reputation for not taking kindly to people who pushed him, and most comedians knew better than to target him directly. Rickles was not most comedians. When Sinatra appeared in 1976 and took his seat next to Rickles, what happened next was one of the most genuinely daring moments in the show's history. Rickles launched into a roast, treating Sinatra with the same irreverent disrespect he would show anyone at his nightclub act. He called Sinatra overrated. He kept going long past the point where most performers would have backed off, while Carson watched from behind his desk with a smile that was clearly masking real nervousness. Carson had seen Sinatra's temper before. The whole studio was holding its breath. Then Sinatra laughed. A genuine burst of laughter from a man who clearly appreciated being treated like a normal person rather than handled with kid gloves. Carson later admitted privately that the moment had required real courage from Rickles, because the risk had been genuine. Dolly Parton came onto The Tonight Show in 1977 as one of the biggest names in country music, already famous for her willingness to joke openly about her own figure. She and Carson bantered throughout the interview in the playful way that was a hallmark of the show. Then Carson made a comment that stopped everything cold. It was direct, personal, and the kind of thing that would end a career today. The studio audience reacted with gasps and nervous laughter. Parton handled it with grace, laughing it off as though it were simply another part of the banter. But the moment was already captured on live television and could not be taken back. The comment generated more viewer mail than almost anything else in the show's history. Some defended Carson, arguing that Parton herself had shown no offense. Others said it was inappropriate regardless of the era. Carson never addressed it publicly, though people close to him said he acknowledged privately that he had crossed a line. What makes the moment significant beyond the controversy is what it reveals about how television and public discourse have evolved, and how Carson, who spent his entire career knowing exactly where the line was, finally misjudged it. Bob Hope was a comedy legend, and that fact is not in dispute. But by the 1980s, when Hope was in his late 70s, something had changed, and Johnny Carson could see it clearly even if he would never say so publicly. Hope's appearances during this period were painful to watch. He would arrive with material that felt recycled, jokes delivered with mechanical precision that had lost all connection to the audience in front of him. Carson was too professional and too respectful of Hope's legacy to ever let his discomfort show on camera. But the people who worked on the show could see the tension in his face, the way his smile would tighten. After one particularly difficult appearance, Carson made a rare private comment that revealed just how uncomfortable the experience had been. It was not cruel. It was the observation of one comedian watching another reach a point where the spark that had made him great was no longer there, and it carried a sadness that went beyond frustration. Carson understood that comedy has a shelf life, and watching Hope struggle was a reminder of something no entertainer wants to face. Jimmy Stewart was not a comedian in the way most Tonight Show guests were, but he was a beloved regular, and he and Carson had developed a warm rapport over the years. In 1981, Stewart mentioned he had written a poem about his dog Bo, who had recently died. Carson invited him to read it, probably expecting something lighthearted. What Stewart actually read was something much deeper. The poem started simply but gradually revealed emotions about love, loyalty, and loss in the most universal sense, about reaching out in the dark for something no longer there. By the time Stewart finished, the studio was completely silent. Carson was visibly moved, not performing emotion for the audience, but genuinely feeling something that he did not try to cover with a joke or a quick transition. He simply sat with the moment and let it exist, and in doing so gave the audience permission to feel it too. It remains one of the most remembered segments from Carson's entire run, not because it was funny or surprising, but because it was true in a way television almost never allows. Joan Embry brought a large Burmese python onto The Tonight Show one evening in the late 1970s, and the segment started the way these things usually did, with her explaining facts about the snake while Carson listened. Then the python started moving. It slithered off the desk and headed toward Carson, and what happened next was one of the most purely instinctive reactions ever captured on live television. Carson jumped out of his chair with a speed that surprised everyone, backing away with an expression of genuine alarm that had nothing to do with performing. The audience went wild. Once the snake was safely recaptured, Carson straightened his tie, sat back down, and delivered a punchline that perfectly captured the moment. It was funny because it was real. For just a few seconds, the king of late night was not a television host. He was just a man who did not want a giant snake anywhere near him, and the audience loved him for it. George Carlin spent much of his career testing the limits of what television would allow him to say, and his appearances on The Tonight Show were always a chess match between the comedian and the network. During a 1983 appearance, Carlin delivered what sounded like an ordinary monologue, but buried inside was a subtle jab at network censorship so cleverly constructed that it got past the standards department before anyone realized what had happened. Carson caught it immediately. His reaction, a knowing smile and a quick glance toward the camera, told everyone watching exactly what was going on. He was not going to call attention to it or pretend he had missed it. He was simply going to let it stand. Carson reportedly defended Carlin privately when the network raised concerns, arguing that if the standards department had not caught what Carlin was doing until after it aired, then the comedian had earned the right to get away with it. Dean Martin's drunk act was one of the most successful characters in the history of American entertainment, and it worked because no one could ever tell where the act ended and reality began. When Martin appeared on The Tonight Show in the 1970s and leaned hard into that character, slurring words and missing his chair, Carson understood exactly what was happening and played along beautifully. Rather than trying to rein Martin in, Carson became his straight man, setting up situations that allowed the supposedly intoxicated performer to deliver increasingly outrageous responses. The segment reached its peak when Martin started a story, lost his thread completely, looked confused, and then dismissed the whole thing as not worth telling. The audience erupted because they could not tell whether that was the act or the real Dean Martin, and that ambiguity was exactly what made the moment work. Don Rickles could genuinely disrupt The Tonight Show in ways no other guest could, and the moment that proved this most dramatically came when Carson had just begun his nightly monologue. Rickles, scheduled to appear later that night, started heckling loudly from backstage. His voice carried through the curtain clearly enough that the audience could hear it, and Carson, for the first time in anyone's memory, stopped his monologue completely. He turned toward the curtain and called Rickles out onto the stage, bringing him into the show a full segment earlier than anyone planned. It was unprecedented. The monologue was supposed to be untouchable, the one element of the show that never changed, and Carson had just walked away from it because something more interesting was happening. Rickles came out feigning innocence and clearly delighted, and Carson seemed energized by the spontaneity rather than annoyed by the disruption. Sammy Davis Jr. was one of those entertainers who genuinely had no limitations. He could sing, dance, act, and do impressions at a level that most performers could not match in even one discipline. One night in the 1970s, without any setup, Davis launched into a rapid sequence of impressions that lasted less than a minute but contained more range and precision than most performers could deliver in an entire set. He moved seamlessly between legendary entertainers, capturing not just their voices but their entire physical presence and timing. Carson watched with the kind of open, helpless delight he reserved for the very rare moments when someone genuinely surprised him. Carson once told someone close to him that Davis was the most complete entertainer he had ever encountered, that if you could only watch one person perform for the rest of your life, Davis would be the smart choice because he could become dozens of different entertainers. That assessment, coming from Carson, was about as high as praise could go. Arnold Schwarzenegger walked onto The Tonight Show in the mid-1980s to promote his latest film, and the segment was supposed to follow the standard predictable pattern. Instead, when Carson asked his first question, Schwarzenegger responded entirely in German. Not a brief joke before. Switching back to English, but a full, earnest answer in a language that neither Carson nor most of the audience could understand. Carson had no idea this was coming. But rather than shutting it down, he found the comedy in the chaos. He began responding as though he understood every word perfectly, nodding thoughtfully and interjecting with nonsensical sounds, playing the absurd exchange completely straight. The audience caught on and started laughing at two famous men pretending to have a conversation neither of them was actually having. When Schwarzenegger finally switched to English, it became clear the moment had worked precisely because Carson chose to play along rather than assert control. That willingness, that confidence that the best television does not always come from the host being in charge, was the thing that separated Carson from every other late-night host who came before or after him. It was the reason 30 years of live television produced moments like these, moments nobody planned, nobody predicted, and nobody has ever been able to top.